Preventable trauma is going to cover particularly head injuries, and then cover a few of the ways kids get hurt and how to prevent them. Some special considerations up front. There are two populations of kids that get into trouble. The first one is going to be those who are too young to know what they're doing, less than 3. And then those who are too drunk to remember, adolescents playing Superman. When you see trauma, what you have to be able to do is know what to do about it when you see it, and be able to distinguish abuse from an accident, which can be much harder than you'd think. Let's start off with head trauma, and head trauma is particularly important because kids have disproportionately large heads. So when they go airborne, thrown from a vehicle, pedestrian struck, they play lawn dart, head into the ground first. And in head trauma, what you're going to want to be able to do is identify 3 different syndromes and correlate them with the CT scan. We have an entire section dedicated to head trauma in the trauma series. So for more information, check that out. Here's what you need to know for pediatrics. You need to be able to separate the epidural hematoma from the subdural from a cerebral contusion. The epidural hematoma is going to occur from a strike to the head. And what you should look for is anything that involves ball sports, like baseball, and skiing, particularly in those who are not wearing helmets. In the epidural hematoma, the syndrome is nicknamed walk, talk, and die. That is, there is a loss of consciousness. Then the kid wakes up, seems to be fine, and as the bleeding hematoma expands, they go into a coma and die. Usually the middle meningeal artery, if you remember from your anatomy. What you're looking for in the CT scan is a lens-shaped hematoma. Subdural hematomas require a significant amount of trauma in kids. In adults, especially those who are alcoholic or elderly with degenerative brains, the brain comes off the side of the skull, stretches the bridging veins, so a little bit of trauma causes subdural hematoma, shearing of those bridging veins. In kids whose brain is full in the skull, it takes a tremendous amount of trauma to shear those. So what you're looking for is going to be a pedestrian struck. And remember, young kids who are shorter get hit in the shoulder and go airborne, whereas adults get hit in the hip and land on the hood of the car. An MVA where the child is thrown from the vehicle, or shaken baby syndrome, which is abuse. Tremendous amount of trauma puts the kid into a coma, and then they stay in a coma. What you're looking for on the CT scan is a crescent-shaped hematoma. The idea goes something like this. A kid who falls out of a crib or out of a chair generally does not fall enough or hard enough to cause a subdural hematoma. An adult holding a child by the ankles and slamming it into a wall, or picking up an infant and shaking it very vigorously because it won't be quiet, is enough trauma to cause a subdural. If you see a subdural in any kid under 3, it's probably abuse. If you see a subdural in a teenager playing Superman, it's probably not. Lastly is the contusion. What you're going to see is some sort of deceleration injury that ends up with a loss of consciousness. This is generally going to be a sport injury, especially football, helmet to helmet. What happens is the body is moving forward, the brain is moving forward, and all of a sudden the body stops. The brain is in fluid, and so it keeps going forward and strikes the front of the skull. It's the coup injury, and then sloshes to the back of the skull, the contra-coup injury. There is a loss of consciousness, and the CT scan is going to show you punctate hemorrhages, usually intraparenchymal. The treatment of these generally involves reducing intracranial pressure and trying to evacuate the hematoma. But this is about prevention, so what can you do to prevent these head traumas from happening? It's going to break down into car safety, helmets, and what you do about trampolines. Car safety is the big one. You can help mom and dad better understand what to use at what time. See what I mean? Car safety involves rear-facing car seats a booster seat, and then seat belts. The rear-facing car seat is used between ages 0 and 2. The day they leave the hospital, they must have a car seat, and the car seat must be rear-facing and in the back seat. Baby must be restrained to the car seat, and the car seat must be restrained by a seat belt to the car. If you have it in the front seat, the airbag deploys into the back of the car seat, launching baby into the chair. If you don't restrain the baby or the car seat, you launch either one as a missile when the car decelerates. And it has to be rear-facing, because if you slam on the brakes and it's forward-facing, baby gets launched out of the chair through the window. Rear-facing, back seat, seat belted to the car. The booster seat is used as a bridge between childhood and adult, and you must be this tall to ride this ride. 4 foot 9 inches is about the height that's required for the seat belt, and of course everyone should be wearing seat belts all the time. The problem is that the strap of a seat belt is designed for an adult, and it goes from shoulder to waist. If a small child gets in the seat and wears a seat belt and the strap's across their face, it's not going to do very much. The problem is that booster seats are designed for those under 4'9". This is usually achieved at ages 8 to 12. You can imagine that a freshman in high school or someone in junior high does not want to roll up in a minivan sitting in a booster seat with their mom driving. So it may be that kids don't use the booster seat when they should. Helmets. Anytime you're playing sports, you should always have a helmet. And it is those sports that do not require helmets, like soccer or women's field hockey, where the player might get clubbed or headbutted in the head and suffer head trauma. Of course, even if you are wearing helmets, head trauma can still occur. And for the test, eliminate trampolines. Having nets doesn't count. Water or soft landing around it doesn't count. Get rid of trampolines if you want to avoid head trauma. I do want to spend a lot of time on concussion. 1, because we have changed how we manage concussions, and 2, because it's in the popular media right now. The pathology behind a concussion is going to be head trauma and no bleed. You don't know there's no bleed until you do a CT scan, so we'll see that in a minute. And it's almost always going to be a sports injury. Either a helmet-to-helmet football collision or taekwondo tournament where someone gets kicked in the head. Doesn't matter, if the kid gets hit in the head, you should consider concussion. Now, we've changed the way we do concussion. It used to be graded based on the duration of the loss of consciousness, what type of amnesia there was, anterograde, retrograde, and then it fit into this very neat table that told you what to do. Turns out it's all bogus. So we don't grade concussions any longer. But because the USMLE Step 2 cannot throw you any curveballs, the vignette must be clear, and so you should grade concussions into mild or severe. And either it will be severe or it will be obviously mild. And you're going to separate these based on the presence or absence of focal neurologic deficit, the duration of loss of consciousness, the presence of a headache, and amnesia. A mild concussion will have a loss of consciousness, or very brief, that is less than 60 seconds in duration. There will not be a focal neurologic deficit and will be no headache, or it is getting better. The amnesia will not be present. Of course, they might have a little amnesia of when they collided, because they were out for the loss of consciousness, but you should see no amnesia, no deficit, no headache, and a short duration to consider it mild. Whereas if you have a focal neurologic deficit, the duration of loss of consciousness was greater than 60 seconds, there is a headache or it's worsening, and worsening might be pain, nausea, or vomiting, or you see either retrograde or anterograde amnesia, you have severe. And I like this method because it shows you what to do based on what you find. If you find a mild concussion, you do not do a CT scan or diagnostic test, and you don't need to do anything to treat it. They can simply go home and be monitored. Whereas if you have a severe concussion, what you're doing is getting a CT scan to rule out a brain bleed. These things imply more than concussion. A concussion has a negative CT scan. You're getting the CT to rule out a bleed because it's so severe. And even if the CT scan is negative, you're going to admit, because you had a concern for neurochecks. Now, regardless of what you do, omit for observation, send them home, what you're going to do is allow them to return to play in a stepwise fashion. The question comes up, there could be a concussion, can my kid return to play? The answer is no. They go home, they do nothing. And you're going to progress from sleeping, doing nothing, to contact sports in a stepwise fashion. Leaving the house, returning to school, starting to do homework, the brain intellectual stuff, and then you can go back to practice, scrimmaging, and eventual play. At any time there's a headache or symptoms worsen or the kid can't do the task they're doing, they step back and start over. Head trauma, lot to know. We're going to close out this lecture with a few highlights on drowning, special consideration for pediatric burns, and then we'll talk about gun safety, which also can correlate into chemical safety. They share some of the same principles. When it comes to drowning, I'm going to reiterate, the type of people who drown are going to be those who are poor swimmers. Those who are too young to know how, and those too drunk to remember. It takes only a teaspoon of water to drown, so any water source is sufficient to cause a drowning. But the people who are at highest risks are going to be young kids and babies who barely are able to walk, let alone swim, and those adolescents who get drunk and do stupid things like dive into shallow water. What you should look for are going to be tubs, pools, and even buckets. The thing you are mopping your floor with is enough for a toddler to tumble into, head being bigger than the rest of their body, and drown. The way you prevent drowning is by limiting access and providing supervision. Preventing access is going to be things like gates and fences. It is rarely your child who drowns in your pool. It's usually the neighbor's kid who comes over and uses the pool when you're not there because you didn't prevent that access. Supervision is going to come in the way of lifeguards at public beaches. But really what supervision emphasizes is that if you have a pool and your kid is in it, you should be at the pool. More importantly, if you're going to give baby a bath, you don't turn on the water and walk away. You don't put baby in the tub and go answer the phone. Constant presence and constant supervision will avoid accidental drownings. And lastly is going to be flotation. Floaties, the things that all those kids wear, bad. They're awesome, right? Because they're flotation devices and the kid likes to wear them on their bicep. They're like, yeah, big muscles. And they work. So long as the kid is awake, he can doggy paddle and stay afloat. But the problem is that the floaties keep the arms on top, not the head. So if baby goes unconscious, those floaties drown baby. Instead, what you should be using is life jackets. Water sports, on a vehicle, in the water in any way, the way you prevent drowning is by wearing a life jacket. Now there are some considerations I'm not putting on the board that might come up in a discussion on the wards. Saltwater drowning, worse than freshwater drowning because of pulmonary edema. Cold water drowning, probably better than warm water drowning because the metabolic demand decreases and they can stay hypoxemic longer. But what you want to learn about drowning is how to prevent it. In burns, what I want you to remember is the Parkland formula, and then 50-50, 8 and 16. That is 50% of the Parkland formula fluid is given in the first 8 hours, and 50% of the Parkland formula fluid is given in the next 16. You calculate the Parkland formula by considering the percent of the body surface area burned, and you only include second or third degree burns. First degree burns don't count, times 4 times the kilogram body weight. And special consideration for kids is that their heads are bigger. So the rule of nines changes. We have an entire lecture on burns and trauma, which you can watch for more details. This is the front of the body. You can tell by which way the feet are going. This is the back. Again, you can tell by which way the feet are going. The rule of nines in kids. The heads are bigger. So the front of the head is worth 9. The back of the head is worth 9. When it comes to the chest and abdomen, it's actually quite easy to remember. It's 9 and 9. That is, the front chest is 9, the back chest is 9, the front abdomen is 9, the back abdomen is 9. You can remember it as sections or faces. The chest, 9 in front, 9 in back is 18. The abdomen, 9 in front, 9 in back is 18. Or the front is 9 and 9, 18, and the back is 9 and 9, 18. Easy there. The arms, front and back combined, are worth 9. So you'll see that I won't put anything here on the inner arms because they're already accounted for in the outer. And the last frustrating thing about kids is that the 4 compartments of the leg, that is left, right, front, and back, only account for 3 9s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's 99%, and 1% for genitalia. Different rule of 9s, 50, 50, 8, and 16 remains the same. The last thing we want to talk about is gun safety. The answer is going to be eliminate guns from the home. Every society that talks about pediatrics and gun safety says eliminate. This is a political topic, and you may not be able to convince a gun owner to eliminate guns from the home. The thing is that you are far more likely to have an accidental discharge than to engage a threat. You're far more likely to have your child accidentally pick up and use the weapon against themselves, another child, or a family member than you are to defend your home. But if they will not give up their weapons, you can follow these principles, which then comes into chemical safety. That is, you keep them up high, out of reach, and you keep them locked. This is achieved both with a gun safe, or a locked cabinet in the way of chemicals, and a gun lock. This is achieved in chemicals by way of kid-proof twist-off tops, which don't really work. The gun safes must be locked and kept up high. For guns, you're going to keep the weapon separate from the ammo. That is, you can recommend a loaded magazine be in one place and the actual weapon be in a gun safe. It's less accessible if you need to use it to defend yourself, but it's also less accessible for the kid to put the two together and hurt someone else. Lots covered. Head trauma, be able to separate the syndrome and CT scan of epidural, subdural, and contusion. Know the difference between car seats, booster seats, and seat belts. For concussion, mild versus severe is going to tell you to not image or image, return in a stepwise fashion. If head trauma and loss of consciousness, no more play that day. For drowning, limit access with gates and fences, provide supervision with lifeguards and your eyes, and then for flotation, use life jackets. For burns, different rule of 9s, 50, 50, 8, and 16. For gun safety, eliminate guns from the home. If you can't, store them up high and in locked cabinets, the same for chemicals. That is preventable trauma.